Number 7. Karil Belarusov. French film producer Laureline Garcia Berthaud was reported missing on March the 5th of 2019 after she'd failed to show up for work at the PR firm Golia, where she was an executive assistant. In the days leading up to her disappearance, several of her friends reportedly received text messages sent from her phone, the nature of which they would later describe as strange and confusing. The text indicated that Garcia Berthaud had gone on a shopping spree with her ex-boyfriend, Karil Belarusov, who'd allegedly offered to purchase her a new home. The producer's friends were surprised, considering their knowledge of the latest developments in the former couple's relationship. Belarusov, an aspiring stuntman, had been emotionally abusive towards Garcia Berthaud for months prior to the messages being sent, and he also reportedly owed her thousands of dollars. The day after she'd been reported missing, Garcia Berthaud's body was found buried in a shallow grave in the garden of her Kew apartment. Investigators identified Belarusov as the likely perpetrator of her murder, as he'd been captured on CCTV footage at her flat. He'd also been spotted buying a series of items including trash bags, duct tape, and an axe, which the authorities concluded was part of a kit he would later use to kill Garcia Berthaud and clean up the scene. Following an investigation, it was determined that Belarusov had won back his ex-girlfriend's sympathies by faking a cancer diagnosis. He then spent a couple of days with the woman after unfoundedly promising to buy her a new home. Garcia Berthaud eventually discovered his various lies and presumably confronted him. At that point, Belarusov strangled her to death with a cable which reportedly took over 4 minutes. Once she was dead, Belarusov bound her arms behind her back, wrapped trash bags around her body and discarded it in the garden. Afterwards, he sent text messages from her phone to some of her friends before fleeing to Estonia. He was eventually tracked down, arrested and extradited back to the UK, where he was ultimately convicted of the murder and sentenced to life in prison. Number 6. Christian Gerharts. In the late 1970s, German teenager Christian Gerharts befriended an American couple who were traveling in West Germany. He would later use their names to obtain permission to enter the United States, falsely claiming that they'd invited him to stay with them at their California home. By 1979, Gerhards had settled in Berlin, Connecticut, where he was living with the family of author Edward Savio. Over the course of the next several years, Gerhards used a multitude of aliases as he traveled across the country, pretending at various times to be an actor, a physicist, a ship's captain, and even an English aristocrat. In 1995, while living under the name Clark Rockefeller, he married a successful businesswoman named Sandra Boss, whom he'd reportedly convinced that he was a descendant of American oil tycoon John D. Rockefeller. Boss eventually filed for divorce from Gerhards, citing his secretive and controlling tendencies as reasons for their deteriorated relationship. She also hired a private investigator who would make the discovery that Gerhards was not in fact a member of the Rockefeller family. On August 2nd of 2008, the imposter was arrested for having abducted his daughter while she was visiting him. Following his criminal conviction, he was sentenced to 4 to 5 years in prison. By the spring of 2009, investigators had identified Gerhards as a person of interest in the 1985 murder of Jonathan Sohus. He'd previously been a tenant in a guest house owned by Sohus' mother, and it was ultimately determined that he'd bludgeoned the man to death before hiding his remains. Gerhards was convicted of first-degree murder in 2013 and subsequently sentenced to 27 years to life in prison, with credit for the 1 year he'd already served. Number 5. Mark Nye. In February of 2020, police officers in Surrey, England, pulled over a vehicle driven by a man who would subsequently identify himself as Connor. According to reports from the authorities, the suspect had been stopped while he was trying to dispose of a package containing illicit substances and a pair of cell phones. The police also reportedly found hundreds of business cards for McGregor Enterprises inside his vehicle. The man was identified as 34-year-old Mark Nye, and he was placed under investigation by local law enforcement, who later found a large amount of boric acid in his home. They also discovered hundreds of text messages on his phone that detailed his various dealings as a purveyor of illegal drugs throughout suburban London. It would later emerge that Nye had modeled his appearance after MMA fighter Conor McGregor and was using the celebrity's name and likeness to promote his criminal business. Nye ultimately pleaded guilty to possession with the intent to supply Class A drugs, and in April of 2021, he was sentenced to 3 years in prison. Number 4. Vincent Marks. An off-duty Assumption Parish Sheriff's deputy was involved in a near collision while traveling down Louisiana Highway 70 on June the 10th of 2021. Shortly thereafter, a vehicle moved closely behind the deputy and began flashing its headlights continuously. The officer eventually pulled into the parking lot of a convenience store, and the car that had been following him reportedly parked directly behind him, blocking in his vehicle. The driver of the second car approached the deputy and presented him a badge, allegedly represented himself as a police officer. The deputy, however, recognized the man from a domestic incident that had taken place in Pierre Part earlier in the year, and thus knew that he was not, in fact, a member of law enforcement. A subsequent investigation into the incident uncovered that the police impersonator was 27-year-old Vincent Marks, a Plaquemine resident. He was arrested and charged with felony false impersonation of a peace officer. He was booked into the Assumption Parish Jail and his bond was set at $10,000. Number 3. Heather Garcia. On August the 31st of 2019, law enforcement officials in Farmington, Utah, pulled over a silver BMW upon noticing that it didn't have a license plate. The driver of the vehicle claimed not to have any form of identification with her, reportedly telling the officers that her name was Mercedes and that she was born in 1998. The police performed a search of her car, at which point they found drug paraphernalia and a white, powdery substance inside. The officers then discovered an ID card in the driver's purse and were able to identify her as 38-year-old Heather Garcia, which didn't correspond to the name she'd initially given them. It emerged that she'd actually provided the deputies with her daughter's identity. A preliminary records check indicated that she had multiple outstanding arrest warrants in Davis County. Garcia was consequently taken into custody and detained on several drug-related charges, as well as charges of driving with a revoked license and offering false personal information to a police officer. Number 2. Anna Sorokin. In the summer of 2013, a young woman named Anna Delvey traveled to New York City to attend the semi-annual New York Fashion Week. The 22-year-old was on location working as an intern for the French fashion magazine Purple. Delvey left the publication a short time later, but she decided to remain in New York to establish the Anna Delvey Foundation, a private members club and art organization. She reportedly struggled in her initial attempts to obtain funding for her idea from members of the city's social elite. A local club DJ named DJ LD would later tell investigators that Delvey had claimed she was a wealthy German heiress during a party at the luxury hotel called the Standard Highline. Over the next few years, Delvey reportedly relied on the purported inheritance promised to her by her illustrious German heritage to make connections with prominent artists and entrepreneurs. Some of them agreed to help bring her vision for the Anna Delvey Foundation to fruition. She organized expensive dinner parties and moved from one boutique hotel to the next, constantly avoiding paying her bills by promising wire transfers that never materialized. Eventually, on October the 13th of 2017, Delvey was arrested in Los Angeles County, California. It emerged that Delvey's real name was actually Anna Sorokin, and that her claims of being the heiress to a large fortune had been entirely fabricated. From 2013 to 2017, Sorokin reportedly stole a total of $275,000 from financial institutions, banks, hotels, and many of her acquaintances by forging bank statements and neglecting to pay off the debts she accrued. In May of 2019, she was sentenced to 4 to 12 years in prison after being found guilty of 8 charges, including second-degree grand larceny. Sorokin was released on parole in February of 2021, but was ultimately taken back into custody by Immigration and Customs Enforcement for allegedly overstaying her visa. Her case inspired a Netflix television series entitled Inventing Anna that was released in February of 2022. It centered on Sorokin's elaborate fraud and was reportedly the most watched program on the streaming service during the first week of its release. Number 1. Shana Golia. Starting in 2012, Nebraska man Dave Krupa began receiving an incessant stream of emails and text messages from his ex-girlfriend, whom he'd only dated for a couple of weeks. The harassment, which began shortly after the end of Krupa's relationship with 37-year-old Carrie Farver, continued for the next 3 years. Throughout that period of time, Krupa was sent tens of thousands of messages. The man reportedly changed his cell phone number several times, but Farver always managed to obtain his new contact information and thus resume her unwanted communications. In a televised interview with ABC, Krupa recounted how he'd once received a chilling message from his stalker that detailed the exact position he was in on the lazy boy chair in his living room. Detectives uncovered that there were also threatening messages sent from Farver's social media account to another one of Krupa's ex-girlfriends, Shana Golia. The situation abruptly turned violent when the latter was allegedly assaulted by Krupa's crazed former partner. Golia's house was vandalized and set on fire, and she suffered a gunshot wound to the leg. The authorities soon became suspicious of Golia after detecting a number of inconsistencies in the story she'd given to the police during her interviews. Upon investigating the matter further, the authorities built a case against Golia, who, in a dramatic twist of events, was identified as Krupa's true stalker. The woman was revealed to have perpetrated the damage to her property herself before shooting her own leg in an attempt to portray herself as a victim. Body parts were found in her possession that investigators were able to link to Farver, whom they determined to have been murdered on November the 13th of 2012, the last day she'd been seen alive. Golia had reportedly set her murderous plan into motion after growing jealous of Krupa's relationship with Farver. She impersonated a woman after killing her and began relentlessly tormenting her ex. In 2017, the scorned lover-turned-murderer was sentenced to life in prison, plus an additional 18 to 20 years for second-degree arson. Thanks for watching. Would you rather have an evil twin who gets you into trouble or always be mistaken for an infamous serial killer who shares your name? Let us know in the comments section below.